Okay, this is the third time I'm shooting this review. And that's because the more that I use this camera, the more that my thoughts on this camera change. Now, I've been using this camera for the past few weeks on a few different shoots. And generally, I can say that I really like the camera. I do like the way that this camera is set up, as it's kind of like an all-encompassing cinema solution. You get a great monitor, great film assist tools, an awesome menu system, and an image that's surprisingly good for a micro four thirds sensor. So first off, I had to get a cage to even mount this on my gimbal because this camera's just ridiculously wide. Once I got the cage, I got this thing set up on my RS2 and took it outside to get some shots of my cars just to try it out with the anamorphic lens. Now, I do need to caveat my experience with this camera by saying that I've exclusively been using the Sirui 35mm f1.8 anamorphic lens as kind of my main lens for any setup. As you can see from some of these shots, I was able to get some flare from the anamorphic lens, but overall you'll see that the image is really clean, and shooting in the log profile, which is actually called film, I was able to get the most out of my images. And normally what you'll see in lower end sensors is you'll see a lot of noise once you start bringing up the shadows, but I didn't really get that from this camera. This image really holds together. This is my first time using this camera on the RS2, and what I realized from this setup was actually how heavy it is, especially with the cage and the lens. Once you start adding these things up, it is a big package. Aside from the weight, the battery also died on me at 30%, and the camera just completely shut off. Next, I took this camera out on a paid gig. I was shooting a live recording for an artist and a band and decided to use this camera as my B cam. It was interesting though, because throughout the night it ended up becoming my A cam, just because for someone like myself who really likes to shoot slow-mo B-roll, having that high frame rate mode button is really nice. Now, the things that I learned from this shoot were the battery life is still incredibly poor. Because I had the camera on my RS2, it was a lot easier to just use the internal LPE6 batteries. Unfortunately, they did not last very long. I would set the camera up, turn it off, and then turn it on just before we started shooting and press record, and it was lasting me for about one take, and it was about 8 minutes per take. So after each take, I would find the battery would be at around 47%, which is pretty close to 30%, which I know in my head already the camera's gonna die and shut off at 30%. So I was swapping batteries in between each take of 8 minutes, which to me is kind of impractical, but I made it work regardless by bringing multiple batteries. Now, I really like how the images turned out from this shoot. The sensor gives you a lot of room to play with how the image looks, whether it be a stylized look or just a natural Rec 709 look. Generally speaking, I really like the dynamic range that the sensor has. It gives you a very cinematic look just straight out of the camera with a simple light applied. After that shoot, reviewing the footage, I was impressed with the image quality. But I figured out a hack for my workflow, and this is where everything changed for me. So I primarily shoot on a gimbal, and the gimbal that I use mostly is the RS2. And I forgot that I even bought this LPE6 dummy battery. This single dummy battery changed my experience with this camera, and I'm going to tell you why. Being able to power this camera from the gimbal is kind of game changing for me because, like I said, I primarily shoot on a gimbal. So this newfound workaround gave me new hope for using this camera. So I decided, let me just try and use it one more time. So I had to shoot a promo for my cousin's GoFundMe page, and I decided to use this camera again. And this shoot for me is what changed my outlook on this camera.
My name is Ramir, and I play soccer.
Spain is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, bro. Like, at his age, a lot of kids don't get the opportunity to go to Spain to play soccer.
So things I learned while I was shooting this promo video. That high frame rate mode and button is, I think, one of the most underrated features of this camera. Not having to go into menus and switch codecs or resolutions to be able to get your variable frame rate, and having a dedicated button just for that switches seamlessly in between 24 and 60p. It makes this camera awesome for shooting B-roll and A-roll. But what I also learned through this shoot is that you need a fast SD card if you're going to shoot in the high frame rate mode. So if you are going to shoot in ProRes 4K 60, I would recommend either getting a 150 megabyte per second SD card or a 300 megabyte per second SD card, depending on whether you're going to be shooting in LT, just regular 422 or 422 HQ. So now that I have a power solution for the camera that actually works seamlessly with my gimbal, I decided, hey, let me use it for something else. So I had some fun with a couple of my boys, and we did a shoot of one of my cars just ripping up and down the street. And man, and again, I was impressed with the image quality, but I'm not sure if it's just the lens or if it's the camera. Because this lens, I'm gonna tell you, this Cerulli anamorphic lens, it's one of the best investments I've ever made. I absolutely love it. As you can see, we had a lot of fun shooting this, and you're able to see a couple of flares in some of the shots too from the lens. One thing I did learn from this though is you should always recalibrate your gimbal if you change anything on the setup, even if it's minor, just because you don't want to end up with little jitters, which I ended up having. Also, you need to manually select your audio source if you're going to plug a mic into the 3.5mm audio jack or the XLR. You got to select it. So basically everything's good now because I found this new power solution for the camera, right? Well, I did some tests to figure out how quickly it eats through battery while plugged into the gimbal. So what I found was that you can get about 1 minute of idling time on the camera per 1% of the RS2 battery, which, if 1 minute is 1%, that gives you 100 minutes. 100 minutes of battery life is a lot better than 20. Plus, I can always just buy another RS2 battery and have that one fully charged and ready to swap in. While recording, I found the camera lasts about 52 seconds per 1% of the RS2 battery. That being said, you're looking at around an hour and a half of battery life, depending on how you're using it, while powering it through the RS2, which is a lot more acceptable. So my overall thoughts on this camera have changed now that I've used it more and figured out some solutions, and I do really like it. It's a great camera when it's on, which is a challenge because its energy consumption is far beyond its battery capacity. And I just don't really like the idea of having to use an external battery source on a camera that's set up like it's a one-stop shop. But once you do have this camera set up, it won't disappoint you, both in image quality and in usability. Now, I'll be honest, I'm still on the fence about if I'm actually going to return this camera or not, but we'll see what the next week holds, and that'll determine whether or not I keep the camera. But hey, I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for watching.